Hello, welcome to Stories in Time. My name's Eloise Schottler. I'm your storyteller. Today I'm bringing you a storyteller, an old storyteller from my hometown, Charlotte, North Carolina. I would never have found it as a story if I hadn't been doing a little bit of genealogy about 20 years ago. And I ran across the story of it, 1880, that was posted in the Charlotte Observer. Now, as you enter Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, you come in, and as you turn to the right, there is an obelisk. And if you look close, it's about 4 feet tall. If you come up close, it has an elephant on it. I've known that since I was young, and my mother said, if you take just a minute, Eloise, go over there and play around the Elephant Man. And that's what I've always called that, the Elephant Man. But it's so much more than that. 1880, the circus was coming to town. It had been in the Charlotte Observer for several weeks because it would come in, all the trains would come in with the train boxes and the animals and the supplies and the equipment in on the railroad track, and they'd stop, and that's where they'd unload. It was downtown on a back street near St. Peter's Catholic Church. Well, I thought, well, what's this about? I don't know about this story. And this is what happened. This is what happened that day in June. That day, early in the morning, my aunt said, this is how you had to do it. You went early before it got light. This was earlier than I ever did at Eloise, but it's the same. Everybody was going downtown to see the train when it came in because they wanted to see the animals as they were unloaded. You know, they had all sorts of animals, but it was the elephants that were the attraction. And the main attraction was Chief. He was known up and down the East Coast. He was big. He was threatening looking, but he seemed to be a kind animal. And everybody wanted to see him as John King, the elephant trainer, took him off. So they were all gathering around. They slid the door open, and John King stepped up to the open door. They put down some long boards on that would reach the street because they wanted the elephants to walk down those. John King stepped out in front of the elephant. He had on a hat, his usual hat, and he had a stick in his hand that had a little hook at the end so that he could grab hold of the rope that was around Chief's neck and guide him down. And he moved back. But as he moved out, the crowd moved in. And he turned and he saw that the crowd was rushing them. And he started calling out, get back, this is dangerous, get back, get back. But they didn't get back. They came forward. He turned around. He had his long stick in his hand, and he got the rope around Chief's neck and started to turn to pull him back into the car, but it was too late. And he came forward, and as he came forward, as the elephant moved forward, he put his head down, and then he lifted it up, and when he lifted it up with his trunk high, he picked up John King. That hadn't been expected. He picked him up, lifted him high, and then he let down his trunk. And when he did, he tossed John King across the street, and he landed against the brick building on the other side of the street. The crowd began to scream and to yell, but in the meantime, all eyes that were aware of what had happened were on the body of John King as he fell like a rag doll to the street. People ran over and they picked him up. They were very afraid. It didn't look hopeful for John King. They picked him up and carried him across the street to a barber shop where they took down a door, put it across the chair, and laid him down. 2 doctors came and they did what they could as quick as they could. But it didn't help. John King died right there in the barber shop. What were they to do? In the meantime, Chief had quietly walked down that plank onto the street, and he began to walk off, away from the crowd, away from the train. Some people started after him, and finally they did capture him. And they got him by his ropes and took him back into the train car. What to do? The circus was going on in 6 hours. They had to unload, set up out on the fields nearby, and get ready for a 2 o'clock show here in Charlotte. But what were they going to do with John King? Well, John King was a Catholic man, and they knew that. So they walked him on his door up to the St. Peter's Catholic Church and put him near the altar while they found the best casket that they could get hold of without any warning, and they brought that into the church, and they put him in this fine casket and told everybody, come back here as soon as the 2 o'clock show is finished. They set up successfully. Everything was going along. People were unhappy. The people who were the performers in the circus were sad, and they were walking around doing their work with tears streaming down their cheeks, but they had to go forward. This was the only day they had for a show in Charlotte. At 2 o'clock, out in the fairgrounds, the show went on. It started. Oh, it was so beautiful. There were the high line ballerinas that were up there in their beautiful costumes. There was Mr. Lolo, the famous performer, a clown performer up and down the East Coast. He was there. They had the white horses that danced in the circle. All of those things were there, and they did their very best. When the show was over at 4:30, they called everybody to come to follow them, and they made a parade with the calliope, and the elephants that were able to be in the parade, they marched with them, and then the other animals that could be out in the street, the horses, the white horses, marched behind the calliope, and they came back down the street. They didn't change their costumes. They still had on their makeup. You could smell it. And when you entered the church, you had the smell of the makeup and the sweat, and then the candles, the beeswax candles, and the smell of incense, where John King was laying in his casket at the front of the church. They would have a mass, and then they would bury him in Elmwood Cemetery. It was quite something going to happen. The mass proceeded. Elmwood Cemetery was about a mile. It was an in-town cemetery at that time. One of the oldest cemeteries in Charlotte. They had a mass with servers and the priest, and then they all followed behind the church, and they put the casket onto like a caisson, and that was followed by the white horses and pulled by other horses. And the calliope played, and the music just filled the streets of Charlotte. They got there. Someone had given them a small plot near the front gate where they could bury John King. And they did that. They had a prayer at the graveside. And then they went back. They took down all the tents. They packed up all the equipment. They put the animals back in the train. And that night, it pulled out of Charlotte to move on south for another place. I was so excited when I found that story. I'd never known that whole story. My mother would send me down to see the the obelisk with the elephant on it and the elephant man, but I didn't know, so I went to Charlotte Library and I read the whole story, beautifully written out. I was so happy because one of the reasons I wanted to find that was because I was looking for more information about my great-grandfather, John Walter Cobb. And I thought he would have been around 18 years old in 1880. He would have known something. Why, he could even have been one of the servers at the Mass. I didn't find it in the paper, but I could guess to that was true. And I came for a visit, was there for 3 or 4 days, and I went out to my cousin's for dinner, and sitting across from me was my Aunt Loretta, my daddy's sister. And I told her, I said, I have found out of something wonderful that I never knew. And I told her again the story as I had found it about the Elephant Man, John King, and what had happened that day and how it had all gone along. And I said, can you believe it? Can you even think about it? And that they heard them. And she said, well, you're not telling the story exactly right, Eloise. What do you mean? I just read it in the newspaper. I just read it in the newspaper. Here it is, honey. And she says, I don't care what they have in the newspaper. Granddaddy was there. John Walter Cobb, I had been right about that. He had been there. And you're not telling the best part. Those elephants, when they were following the Calliope, were crying behind it. That's what Granddaddy said. He said he saw it, and they had tears running down their faces, those elephants did. And don't you forget that. You remember that. Granddaddy really knew because he was there, and he saw it all. I believe that story, and it's really nice to think about those elephants having been so devoted to John King, who had trained them and who had been so good with them. They had never meant to hurt him. And so today, if you go to Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina, you come in through the big black gate, go to the right, and if you're careful and look, there it is, a 4-foot obelisk. And that's what genealogy is all about. You find the stories. Thank you. I hope you'll come back.